Emsworth, good morning. It's great to be with you. Really good to be back here, though of course I came during the week to record this message, and what a great opportunity to share with you again, but this time from the book of Jonah. And I've been given the opportunity to share an overview of the book of Jonah. And it's got to be one of my favourite books of the Bible. I'm sure for many of you it's a favourite book as well. Now, of course, being given the opportunity to share an overview, you know, as those of you who've met me before will realise, I love archaeology and history. So I can't help it with you today. I want to share with you an overview of Jonah and let you know how confident we can be that the book of Jonah is not myth or legend or fairy tale. It's rooted in real history and concerns real people. And so we're going to think about some of the things that happen in the book of Jonah, not just for what God is doing and what they tell us about what God does, but also to remind us that this is real history. These things really happened. And that's going to be significant for what it tells us about a real God at work among us today. So, what do we know about the events of the book of Jonah? The first great thing, let's just read in verse 1, that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. Okay, the wickedness of Nineveh. Well, we know an awful lot about Nineveh. And when I say an awful lot, I mean that. It was a pretty wicked town, part of a pretty wicked and cruel empire. Mind you, we only really found out about Nineveh about 150 years ago. In fact, I was taking a funeral just a few months ago in a church near Corfmullen, not far from me, near Wimborne. And as I was coming out the church doors, I saw a tomb in front of me, and inscribed on the tomb was this: Sir Henry Austin Layard, the discoverer of Nineveh. This man is born near Wimborne. Back in 1839, in Victorian times, he discovered the lost city of Nineveh. Before that discovery in the 1800s, people didn't even know whether Nineveh really existed or not. Maybe it was just part of a kind of fabrication of the Bible. But this discovery of a certain mound in the land of what's now modern-day Iraq, it was called Mesopotamia then, we now know is the ancient city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire. And that was just the beginning. Not only do we know where Nineveh is, we know an awful lot about what they believed and what they thought, and what I'm going to show you a little bit later on today is how it can even tie in with the book of Jonah. We read in chapter 3, verse 3, a little later, after some disobedience, that Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. A big city. To say 3 days to go through it is probably a reference to all the places you wanted to visit if you were visiting Nineveh. And we know from what Henry Austin Layard found that Nineveh was somewhere between 3 and 7 miles in circumference. So not massive, but with so many places to visit, you'd need to spend a few days there. But Jonah, we learn, didn't want to go to Nineveh. So what is it about Nineveh that would have made him rebellious and not want to obey what God had in store for him? Well, again, the discoveries make it pretty clear. If you look at a map, you'll see where Nineveh lies on one of the great rivers of Assyria. And this is where these excavations took place. And what they reveal about Nineveh is this really important city was the command and control for this empire that spread across the ancient world. And when we say an empire, we're not talking about some tolerant, friendly empire. We're talking about an empire that ruled with an iron rod. And the record of that is spread all around the ancient world. We find it in destroyed cities. We find it in burned out ruins. We find the evidence of how Assyria ran its empire. And it was Henry Austin Layard who made one of the most astonishing discoveries. One of the most astonishing discoveries from Assyria of them all. It was the first reference to Israel, the people of God, from outside of the Bible. What you're looking at here is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. You can see it actually in the British Museum. If you want to go and visit, it's there freely on display. It's been there ever since the 1840s when Henry Austin Layard found it. And on this monument that the Assyrians made is a record of their campaigns against other towns and peoples. And there among them, in fact, very significant, is an entire panel devoted to the Israelites. You have a record here, not only of the people of Israel having to pay tribute to the king of Assyria, Shalmaneser III, but you have images, pictures of the Israelites bringing their tribute. And there, bowing down before King Shalmaneser, is King Jehu. We know his name because the text in Assyrian tells us that. The King Jehu, who we read about in the Bible, we've got the nearest thing to a photograph of King Jehu as he comes to bow down before the Assyrian king. You know, Nineveh controlled the region, and this black obelisk dates to about 100 years before Jonah. So it's even older than the time of Jonah. And it reminds us of how significant this empire was during his day. And of course, the evidence from Nineveh, the evidence from Assyria, helps to confirm what we're reading the Bible is real history. Now, Jonah lived sometime between 780 and 760 BC. So it's a little time after that black obelisk that I showed you. So Jonah lived around that period. Can't be absolutely precise about the date. Some people do like to be, but if you want to know, it may be sometime around the time of Adad Nirari III. Write it down. But we can't be absolutely sure. So we're not going to get too dogmatic about who might have been the king at the time of Jonah. But we do know a lot about the circumstances at the time of Jonah. And one of the things is that Assyria had got bigger and badder and crueler as the years have gone by. And Jonah is called to go and preach to the Assyrians, to Nineveh, to the capital, to the king of Assyria. Now, you know, that would be a little bit like, I don't know, in the 1930s, maybe a Jewish rabbi being told to go and preach to the Reichstag, to go and preach to the upcoming Nazi regime. These people are not good people. And the cruelty with which they inflicted their reign, that would have struck fear into the hearts of any Israelite. But you know, there's more to it than that. We're going to find out, and you're going to find out as you work through the chapters of the book of Jonah, that actually Jonah wasn't really afraid of the Assyrians. He was afraid of what God might do if he forgave the Assyrians. So here we have some images from around modern day Nineveh, and it's tragic. I met somebody whose grandmother lives in Mosul today, which is modern day Nineveh, and she has witnessed the destruction, the absolute destruction of this city in the last 20 years. Because we're talking about the time of the rise of ISIS. And you remember when we were praying about the mayhem in the Middle East, ISIS took control of Mosul, Nineveh, and they absolutely demolished what you're looking at, which is the tomb of Jonah. We can't be absolutely sure it is the tomb of Jonah, but certainly the history is very, very ancient. There's been a veneration of Jonah in Mosul, Nineveh, even down to modern times. And ISIS absolutely trashed it. They devastated it. And then there was bombing afterwards as a result of the war. And what we see now is a scene of absolute destruction and debris. Now, don't get me wrong, it's tragedy that men and women have suffered so much during that time. But God's been at work in all this. You know, actually, in the ruins of Mosul in Nineveh, archaeologists are now discovering things that had never been seen before. The images you're looking at on the screen will show you something of what we now know as a result of ISIS tunneling down underneath Mosul, creating their little kind of barracks to hide from the bombs. They actually tunneled into an ancient palace from the time of Jonah. So imagine that. We can now see, and nobody had been able to do this for nearly 3,000 years, we can actually see into the chambers and the walls and the tunnels of a palace from the time of Jonah. And that tells me, as somebody who loves archaeology, wait and see what is yet to be found as archaeologists continue to sort through the tragic debris from these last few years of conflict in the Middle East. So here is Jonah's story. He is called by God to go from the land of Israel and to head out to the town of Nineveh and preach to the Assyrian court. And Jonah runs away. And we find what is perhaps one of the most famous stories of the Bible of them all. And it's a whale of a tale. Now, okay, I know I'm in fishing territory down here in Emsworth. And I know that if there's one thing you get used to with fishermen is you only trust half the stories they tell. How big was that fish? What is the one that got away? And of course, for hundreds of years now, people haven't wanted to trust the story of Jonah. How can somebody be swallowed by a fish, survive for 3 days? Surely this is the stuff of kids' stories or the stuff of legends. I don't think so. Given what we do know in terms of the history and Nineveh and so on, this book reads like a historical book. Now, if you believe in a God of all power, if you believe in a creator God who created the entire cosmos, the galaxies, the universe, well, we can believe that God can create a situation where Jonah could have been preserved in the belly of a fish. But I think there's actually more going on to this story. And I want to just think a little bit with you, and you'll be thinking more about the fish in weeks to come. But I just want to share with you something that might be a little bit controversial. But I think it really gives an insight into the whole book of Jonah. See, people have had very different theories about what the fish may have been. One suggestion is a shark, maybe something like this, the tiger shark that would be aggressive. Highly unlikely, a tiger shark would have torn any prey to pieces before it ate any of it. More recently, some people have suggested a basking shark. Basking sharks make their way into the Mediterranean. There was one in the news, actually, just a little while ago, and they come around the coast of England as well. So maybe some of you local fishermen have seen a basking shark. And that's another suggestion that's made. They're very large kind of sharks. It might have been possible. But still, could somebody survive inside a shark? Some more sceptical characters have dismissed the whole story as something of an allegory. In fact, in 1782, a German theologian, he wrote a commentary suggesting that actually the fish that swallowed Jonah was a pub on the Mediterranean coast, and Jonah went in and had one drink too many. Well, I know I've seen the Ship Inn locally, and no doubt there are other inns that could fit the bill, but that doesn't fit with what we're reading in the story. Others suggest it might have been a whale. After all, in the story, we're reading about something with a cavernous space, and perhaps something like a sperm whale would have been capable of swallowing Jonah. In some children's books that I've read, you get little illustrations of Jonah inside the belly of the fish. And if you look at the kind of images I can show you on the screen, you can see how it looks like quite a nice living space. Jonah's got an opportunity to sit down and reflect. I've seen some pictures that have had like a desk and a candle, and he can eat sardines and have a little bit of, well, we've experienced lockdown. Maybe Jonah just had lockdown in the belly of a fish. It doesn't really read like that, though. If you read chapter 2 and look at the prayer of Jonah, it doesn't sound like it was some kind of isolated space for him to reflect on his life. No, what's going on in the book of Jonah, I think, describes something far, far more profound than that. There is a story that's told of John Bartley. He was on a whaling ship and got lost overboard in the Atlantic and was swallowed by a sperm whale. And the story goes that 3 days later, they caught the whale, hauled it on board, cut it open, and out jumped John Bartley. He'd managed to survive, though apparently his skin was all bleached white. I investigated that story, and I can see no evidence for truth in it. It's a fisherman's tale. I told you they were good at telling them. No, you know, if you spent time inside a fish, doesn't matter what kind of sea creature it might be, I can't see you surviving. And that makes me read this story a little bit more carefully and notice something that I think is really there in the text. In chapter 1, verse 17, we read, "Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah." And that word swallowed in Hebrew is devoured, destroyed. When we read Jonah's prayer in chapter 2, notice in verse 6, "You, Lord, brought my life up from the pit." In verse 7, "When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you." In other words, the text is describing Jonah as either dead or as close to dead as you could be. In other words, when Jonah cries out to the Lord, what he is crying out for is resurrection. And I believe that's what we're reading in the book of Jonah. I believe that Jonah drowns at the bottom of the sea, is swallowed by the fish, is either dead or as close to dead as you can be, and God restores him to life 3 days later. And we believe in the God of miracles, the God of power. Because we see stories of resurrection elsewhere in the Bible. You know, the widow's son, the widow of Nain, he's brought back to life. And that, by the way, is from the time of Jonah, just before. We read about it in the story of Jesus and Lazarus, his friend, who spent 3 days in the tomb, and Jesus brought him back to life. And now here in the book of Jonah, whatever this fish may have been, I think Jonah is tasting death. And God is restoring him to life. Because even death doesn't get in the way of the purposes and the plan of God. And my real final proof for that point is what Jesus says about the story. See, in Matthew chapter 12, verse 39, Jesus said this, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." 3 days and 3 nights. That's a turn of phrase, by the way. It could be any parts of 3 days. And the point is, in Jewish tradition, in fact, anywhere in the ancient world, they thought this. When someone died, you couldn't be absolutely sure they were dead until about 3 days had passed. Because after all, you know, even today in the modern world, people do get misdiagnosed. You do get stories from around the world of people who've been taken to their funeral a little too soon, and frightening experience, the corpse has come back to life again, not because of a miracle, but because of a misdiagnosis. Well, that's if you do the funeral too quick. If you wait 3 days and 3 nights, there is absolutely no question. A misdiagnosis might run on for a few hours, but it's not going to be run on for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jesus is saying that Jonah is a picture of what he himself would do on another scale. Jesus would spend 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, dead, and he would come back to life. And Jonah is a sign. He is a picture. He is a foretaste of what God can do. And Jonah, I believe, is restored to life. And that fits really well with the story of Jonah, because the story of Jonah in chapters 1 and 2 is all about the downhill run. Jonah is running away from God and it's all going downhill. Chapters 3 and 4 is the turnaround. Jonah is back on track. And chapter 2, verse 1, from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God, is the turning point. And why is it a turning point? Well, do you notice in chapter 1 of Jonah, Jonah doesn't talk to God. He talks a lot, but he doesn't talk to God. God talks to Jonah and Jonah runs away. Jonah talks to the sailors, but he doesn't talk to God. In chapter 2, verse 1, Jonah turns to God. And this is what it took to bring Jonah, the prophet, back to his God, belly of the fish. And so we find Jonah now talking to God. He cries out to God, and that changes everything. And Jonah is vomited back up in verse 10 onto dry land. You know, we know sperm whales vomit up this kind of precious substance. That's one of the things that whalers would look for out in the Atlantic. So we know that a sperm whale could fit with that description, but whatever it is, it's some kind of creature that vomits Jonah back up onto dry land. And you know, if we're disobedient to God, if we are running away in the wrong direction, if we want to head off to Tarshish, that, by the way, is in Spain, and Jonah wouldn't have been allowed in by the British government now, would he? But wherever you try and run, wherever you try and go in disobedience to God, God wants you back because he loves you. And whatever those circumstances are, just like the prodigal son in the pig pens, if you cry out to God, he can get you back on track. And what do you do when you've disobeyed? What do you do when you've made mistakes? Well, just like Jonah, wash off the vomit and get back on track, because God will get you where he wants you to be. And that leads us to our final question. What about us? Where do we fit in this story? So Jonah is now in Nineveh in chapter 3, and you're going to have a great time looking at the story of revival in the ancient world, what God does through Jonah when he preaches in Nineveh. But as someone interested in archaeology, I want to share with you another absolutely stunning little indication of the historicity of the book of Jonah. See, Nineveh is a city in the desert. Okay, it's near the rivers, but it's in the desert. It's in modern-day Iraq, so it's far from the Mediterranean. And yet, what's religion like in Nineveh? And what has God got to do to get Jonah in a position where the people of Nineveh will listen to him? What kind of person would the Ninevites want to listen to telling them about God and the spiritual life? Well, I can show you what the religious life of Nineveh is like. And again, if you go to the British Museum, it's no secret. You can see many of these images from Nineveh, and they are absolutely stunning. You see what's called the merman. This is the image of a man with the mermaid tail, or maybe a man inside a fish. You see the priest image on the right-hand side of a man there with a long beard. And do you see what he's wearing? Look a little bit closer. His hat is the top of a fish, and the cloak is a fishy robe. And then take a look at this. This is a cylinder seal that's been rolled out on clay. And if you look on the right-hand side, and you'll see there's like a little pole sticking up with little lines coming out of it. Look at the man on the left-hand side of that pole. Do you see what he's wearing? He's holding a little bowl or bucket in his hand, and he's got the other hand up in the air, but he's wearing a fish robe, and it's the head of a fish on his head. Got a couple more images here we can just zoom in on. These are from Nineveh. This is the religion of Nineveh. These are priests wearing the robes of fish. These are images of a priest inside a fish. Now, I'm not saying these are images of Jonah. What I am saying is Jonah is the right man to bring the right message to just the right people at just the right time. Because who are these people going to listen to? If there's a religion here that revolves around the fish god, if there's a religion here where the priests are wearing fishly robes, who better to send than a man who has been there, done that, and got the t-shirt? Jonah has lived inside the belly of a fish, possibly died inside the belly of a fish, and been resurrected from inside the belly of a fish. Jonah has been there. He is a man the Ninevites will listen to, because he is a man not only with a message, he is a man who has lived the message. Because he is a man who knows the awesome power of God at work. He is a man who knows God's creative sovereignty over everything in the universe, big fish included. And here is a man who knows about the power and mercy of God. And so when we get to chapter 4, I don't know, you might find it a little bit disappointing to get to the end of the book of Jonah, because Jonah sees incredible revival, a city turned upside down by his message. And yet chapter 4, he seems to be grumpy, he seems to be sulking. What has he learned from this story? Well, that's why I think the book of Jonah is really asking us the question. What have we learned from the story? What do we learn from Jonah? So Jonah does see this incredible revival. By the way, his preaching is true to the word. Jonah preaches in Nineveh 40 more days and this city will be overturned. Message of judgment on Nineveh. But because of the repentance of Nineveh, Nineveh's not destroyed, but it is overturned. It's turned right side up. That's what revival is. It's getting people back to where they were supposed to be. So Nineveh, in that sense, is overturned. It's overturned by the preaching of Jonah and becomes a different kind of place, at least temporarily. And what does Jonah think in chapter 4 and verse 1? But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong, and he became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." Jonah, one of the most successful evangelists in history, is devastated by the fruit of his ministry. He is angry with God. And why is that the case? Why is he so angry at this turn of events? Well, because this gives us an insight into why Jonah ran away. Jonah never ran away because he was afraid of the Assyrians. Jonah wasn't afraid of their empire or their power. Jonah was afraid of the mercy of God. Jonah was afraid that the God of mercy would forgive his enemies. This people like the Nazi empire of the ancient world, Jonah wanted to see them destroyed. Jonah wanted to see them obliterated by the judgment of God. And he was afraid. afraid of God's mercy, afraid that God might use his word to bring revival, conversion. And that's why in chapter 4, there's one little lesson that Jonah still needs to learn. There's a story about a vine that you'll be reading about, a vine that God sends to give Jonah shade from the heat. And then Jonah is so upset again because the vine is eaten by a worm. And then he's miserable again. It's as if God is reminding Jonah that Jonah is so selfish. Jonah's happy when he's happy and he gets what he wants. He's upset when he doesn't have what brings him comfort. Jonah is deeply selfish. And the problem with that kind of selfishness is it goes way beyond possessions. It becomes a selfishness about the mercy of God. Jonah's all right. His family's all right. His tribe are all right. He doesn't care about the Ninevites. But God does. God cares so deeply about them. And not only them, he cares about the animal creation too. You see that in chapter 4, verse 11. Should I, God, not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? Those are the last words of the book of Jonah. And also many animals. See, all through the book of Jonah, God has showed his care for pagan sailors in chapter 1, for a great fish in chapter 2, for the people of Nineveh, including their animals, in chapter 3, and then for a vine and a worm in chapter 4. God cares about the whole of creation. He loves men and women all around this world. He cares about the animals too. What about us? Or have we become so self-centered that we've lost sight of the mercy and the power and the goodness of God? Sadly, Jonah had done. We don't know what happens next after the end of chapter 4. I hope Jonah resolved himself to really obey God, to come to terms with the love of God. But the question really is a question for you and for me this morning. Do we really love God? And if we do we love our friends and our neighbours and our family? Do we love Emsworth? Do we love the people who really annoy us? Do we love those who oppose what we're doing as a church? Do we love and care for this desperately needy world in all its wickedness and all its shapes and forms? Because God does, and so should we. God bless you, Emsworth, as you continue to minister during this strange time of lockdown. And I really pray that the book of Jonah is going to electrify you in ministry in these weeks ahead as we continue to seek to serve him in this world.